You're listening to the Daily Debate on the Voice of Russia. I'm Hywel Davies. Today we're discussing the future of Britain's infrastructure, the vital sinews that keep the country moving and the economy growing. Last month, the government announced £100 billion worth of projects focusing on transport networks, power generation and housing. Danny Alexander, the Secretary to the Treasury, said these were the most comprehensive, ambitious and long-lasting capital investment plans the country has ever seen. While just this week, Heathrow Airport announced plans for building a third and possibly a fourth runway. But there remain significant problems with the country's infrastructure and the government's ambitions. Regulators warn we could face blackouts in coming years due to a failure to build enough power stations. While the price of the flagship HS2 project, the high-speed rail link from London to the Midlands, has shot up to £50 billion. As well as the financial concerns, there are also environmental worries, with activists warning that the government is failing to pay enough attention to the environment when it plans projects. Here to discuss these issues with me are Wolmar, transport specialist and author, Fiona Harvey, environment correspondent for The Guardian, and Robert Oxley, campaign director at the Taxpayers Alliance. HS2 seems to be one of the key projects at the moment. It seems to have problems, especially with the cost of it. Is it indicative of a certain failure to handle infrastructure projects properly, do you think? Christian?
There's never been an infrastructure project as big as this one. So inevitably there are problems about it. But I think the problem lies deeper than that. Essentially HS2, which is a line between London and Birmingham, then on to Leeds and Manchester, is a project that was dreamed up without a proper purpose behind it. So instead of looking at Britain's infrastructure needs, whether they be railways, roads, or better access to ports or whatever, somehow this project emerged as kind of dealing with a relatively small problem, which is overcrowding on a particular line, the main line, the West Coast main line, and then kind of gathered momentum because it was supported by the Transport Secretary in the last government, Lord Adonis, and suddenly got picked up by all three political parties without a proper assessment of it. So now that we're finding that the costs are increasing, and the estimate now is around 50 billion, whereas it started at around 30, 35, if you include rolling stock. Now that the costs are increasing, there is some rising anxiety about it from various political quarters.
We've had Ed Balls coming out today saying that it may be time to look at it again. And Peter Mandelson, Lord Mandelson now, of course, also coming out and saying it maybe not be a project we need to do.
Absolutely. And that means that things are really happening in the wrong way round. Because this debate should have occurred right at the beginning, when it should have set out as possibly one alternative of several, and then we would have had a proper discussion, and then it would have been backed. Instead, we're now having this discussion, and indeed there is a risk that it will now become a sort of political football, with one side, possibly Labour, against it and the others for it.
Robert, you must be worried that we're wasting money hand over fist here.
Well, we have consistently opposed HS2 because the business case does not stack up. What we had in the kind of the last couple of years is that politicians got giddy at the idea that they'd come up with this high-speed line, and this high speed was something which would draw headlines and create attention. But the problem is that the business case, the amount of money that we would generate and benefit from this line and the actual costs have been wildly overestimated. And I think what's happening now is that the government are being found out that they drew up this idea on the back of a fag packet, and that now closer inspection, the TPA has consistently shown how they really underestimated the cost, which is why a project which was meant to be initially 28 billion is now talking about costing 50 billion pounds, and very big assumptions in the business case, such as the idea that none of us work while on a train. These have been found wanting, and so what's becoming clearer and clearer is that HS2 will be a white elephant which won't deliver the benefits that politicians are promising, but will cost every family in this country at least £1,500, and there are big areas where our railway network does need infrastructure investment, but politicians have gone for this big headline project because that's what they think will sound good. That's what will sound like that will feed into the government's current thing of a global race. And so actually, I think with this becoming a bit more of a political football, groups like the former rail minister, Tom Harris, who has come out and said, actually, it's a bad idea. Lord Mandelson, again, has said this might not be the right idea. Even the CBI, somebody who was previously a big cheerleader for this project, have suspended their support for HS2. We do see actually forgive the pun, but the wheels were falling off this carriage here. And maybe actually the government, rather than doing what they'd done previously, which was try and kind of caricature the opponents of HS2 as NIMBYs, as people who didn't want this rail line built in their backyards. They're now actually having to face facts that the numbers simply don't add up.
And can we extract from this one particular project that we might be doing this with other big infrastructure projects?
Well, the problem is that we have seen the Department for Transport get it wrong before. We had the West Coast Main Line debacle where it turned out that the government had designed this flawed bidding process for who would run one of the very big lines in this country. And it turned out that ended up costing us in £40 million at least in compensation. The franchise had to be reopened to bidding. And this only ever came about because basically Virgin, the guys who lost out on this franchise, they said, hang on a second, your sums don't add up. And it turned out that the Department for Transport had got their sums very wrong, that civil servants had ignored advice, had again come up with these back of the fag packet kind of figures. And so this situation where the DfT got it wrong, taxpayers ended up footing the bill. And there's a big question of, well, why can we be confident if they can't get decisions like that right? How can we be sure that they're going to get decisions like HS2 right? So there are big questions about how the government are pursuing their infrastructure projects, and actually, are they getting the best deal for taxpayers, or are we getting the best deal for politicians who are seeking headlines?
And Fiona, we do have HS2 quite controversial in environmental terms, and lots of houses going to be demolished in North London, for example. Do you think we're putting enough emphasis on the environment when we start planning these projects?
Well, there are two environmental aspects to HS2, and they are very much opposed. One is the fact that, yes, you will have to demolish some things, and you will have to, you will have to drive a large railway line through some areas of natural beauty. And yes, some trees might have to be felled and so on. There are ways to compensate for this because, if you look at the environmental impacts, you can try to minimise them by having tunnels in certain places. You can avoid some of the most sensitive sites, and if necessary, you can even move, wildlife from one place to another. So there are ways to mitigate that. And the other environmental impact of HS2 is simply that it's a system of mass transit, and we do need a lot more emphasis on public transport in this country. We have a railway infrastructure that's now carrying more passengers than it has since the 1920s when no one had cars. It's creaking. There hasn't been enough investment in that railway infrastructure, and we really need to get people off roads and increasingly off aeroplanes and onto the railways.
Well, that would seem to argue in favour of HS2, wouldn't it?
Yes, absolutely. That's a very strong case to be made in favour as well. We've just heard the cases against. This is not an easy issue. It will cost a lot of money, and yes, it's a big infrastructure project. But if you just say, oh, well, we've got to be really scared of any big infrastructure project, then you get this kind of stasis that we've been in for decades now. So, we really haven't done a lot in terms of big infrastructure, and I think that's partly why people are so scared of it.
But I'm not persuaded at all about this argument that it's going to take anybody out of the sky. Because actually nobody much flies between the places that are going to be connected. Certainly there are virtually no flights between London and Birmingham. So that's the first stage. Between London and Leeds, Bradford, there's a few, but hardly anybody uses them. Between London and Manchester, yes, there are relatively regular flights, but most people take the train already or drive on the motorway.
Isn't that the alternative, is driving rather than taking mass transit?
No, because there is actually a perfectly good train service, and the supporters of HS2 admit that about 40% of people will be existing rail users who will simply transfer to a higher speed line. And that's not an environmental benefit, that's an environmental disbenefit, because of course a high speed train uses much more energy, not just sort of proportional. It's kind of exponential in terms of the amount of energy it uses. So these trains are scheduled to travel at 300 kilometres an hour, possibly up to 350 kilometres an hour. And that's really going to use up much more CO2, much more fuel than the existing trains.
Isn't the killer for HS2 is that's 50 billion that could be spent elsewhere?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, my argument, and I'm a real rail enthusiast and I write books about the history of the railways, but why I'm so against this is that it will suck all the money out of the existing rail system, as has happened to some extent in France and Spain, other places where there is extensive high-speed networks. All the money has been focused on that. And there just won't be the money available for schemes like improving commuter routes, which will actually take more people out of their cars and onto the railways than this scheme will, or indeed proper intercity services, which could be improved at a much smaller cost than the 50 billion that's been proposed here.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia, and today we're discussing the future of Britain's infrastructure. I'm joined by Christian Wolmar, transport specialist and author, Fiona Harvey, environment correspondent for The Guardian, and Robert Oxley, campaign director at the Taxpayers Alliance. Moving away from the railways for a moment, we've also had Heathrow this week putting forward plans for a third and possibly a fourth runway. That's been bogged down for decades now. Robert, do you think that our planning processes help to build a proper infrastructure, or do they just mean more delay and more problems?
Well, I think it's two sides of things. We need to address the Heathrow question. The airport capacity in London is a big issue, and I think many people, we've seen it on the front page of magazines today, the fact is more people want to fly out of Britain. By 2030 it's going to be 480 million people. By 2050 it's going to be even higher. It's 220 million people today. Lots of people want to fly out of London. Heathrow at the moment is operating at about 95% capacity. I think many people recognise the argument for a hub, the fact that people want to be able to fly in and make those connections. That strengthens business. Boris Johnson, the mayor of London, who is opposed to expanding Heathrow, still recognises that we need that hub airport. But the problem is that politicians don't want to address the political arguments here, because they know that by proposing expansion of Heathrow, they are going to affect some important constituencies. And so they have put off this decision. This is why we've got the Davies Commission, which Heathrow is making the submission to at the moment, saying that they should have a third runway. This is why Boris is proposing a big runway, a big airport out in the southeast. But for too long, politicians have put off these decisions. And we're feeling the constraints here, not only in the business terms, but we're also seeing the environmental impact. Because we've got so many planes holding, in holding patterns around London, we're seeing, CO2, we're seeing greater CO2 emissions into London. So if you actually wanted to solve some of our CO2 emissions at the moment, expanding Heathrow would be a very strong argument there. And I think the other thing is that one of the biggest opponents to Heathrow expansion are the southwest suburbs, the boroughs, which in many of those areas are very well-to-do. And what we have is we have an opposition for people who don't like the sound and don't like the noise of Heathrow. But yet, look at many of those residents. They are on above average more likely to fly. So there is a big issue here that needs to be addressed by politicians, and the planning laws certainly getting in the way, but it's time we need some leadership on the issue.
Fiona, there's an environmental argument in favour of third and fourth runways at Heathrow.
Yes, there is. There are environmental arguments either way, but unfortunately neither case has yet been proved. And I think that the first thing you've got to do, if you're looking at a third runway, is to prove to me that there would be less CO2 because there'd be fewer planes in holding patterns. What tends to happen when you get the expansion of any airport is simply that you get more planes. So, this idea that there are so many planes stuck in a holding pattern above London, I mean, the skies would have to be absolutely full of them in order to outweigh the kind of the environmental costs associated with an expansion of the airport. So, really, if that's the case, then I think we don't have the proof yet. The other sort of environmental case, sort of that some people put forward in favour of Heathrow expansion is this idea that people need to be able to get to Heathrow, by means other than flying from around the country, and that therefore, they could sort of come to Heathrow by train and then get to where they need to go, and that sort of takes pressure off airports in other places around the country. Again, I don't think that's been proved at all. And also, what people who run airports in the regions, what they want is they want their own airports to expand and to have international flights. They want there to be a more distribution of international flights around the country rather than everyone having to come to London. So these are the kind of opposing forces. And then what you also have, of course, is people just worried about the kind of immediate environmental effects on local residents, but also on the skies over London when we have, so many more planes coming in, which is what we will have.
I mean, we have a growing population, so the chances of there being more flights wanted is going to be quite high, isn't it, I would have thought? I mean, our population in the next 15 years is meant to go up to 70 million.
But it all depends on price. I mean, that's the absolute crucial issue that is not really been considered. We heard today that fuel prices for cars might well go up. If flying becomes genuinely really more expensive for average passengers, then it will damp down demand. Now, the key issue really is that the supporters of a third runway say, oh, well, we need it for business purposes. There aren't enough flights to China and whatever. The reality is that we have an awful lot of people, maybe mainly from the other airports in London, flying off to places like Riga or Nice or whatever for a kind of weekend jolly or stag party or whatever because it's so cheap. And if that demand was kind of reduced by the prices going up because of fuel prices, because of carbon taxes, because aviation is under-taxed at the moment, then we might not need this third runway, and that all the business people who need to get to China could get there because there would be enough flight paths for them.
But if we raise prices of a flight, then surely the business cases that we're going to lose out on some of the business people won't come here because they're finding it too expensive.
Well, that will be a global process to some extent, that fuel prices will push the flights going up. Carbon taxes also ought to be certainly a European or global issue, so it won't be a competitive issue between the various airports. And, we've kind of forgotten the environment since 2008. We really have. And, the extremes of weather we're enduring at the moment. For example, we're in the middle of a heat wave and, there are more weather records broken one way or the other than at any other time in history. And that does suggest that the climate is becoming more unstable. That is an absolute crucial issue. And we really ought to look at the expansion of Heathrow within that light.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia, and today we're discussing the future of Britain's infrastructure. I'm joined by Christian Wolmar, transport specialist and author, Fiona Harvey, environment correspondent for The Guardian, and Robert Oxley, campaign director at the Taxpayers Alliance. Robert, do you think there's a case for carbon taxes here, cut down on the amount of transport we do?
I already think the EU emissions trading scheme, the way it works, is damaging economy. Air passenger duty is adding on a huge bill to the average families. The trend is that flying is getting cheaper. That has been the overall trend. And look, that's what people want to do. People want to go to Riga. People want to go and enjoy their family holidays. What are we going to say? That it should only be the preserve of the rich, that they can actually go and enjoy and experience the rest of the world, while everyone else should be kept in the country because, well, we say, we can't build any more airports. It's quite a paternalistic attitude that we're going to take, that saying that, that people just shouldn't be able to fly. The average family shouldn't be able to go on holiday.
That's a completely
that is where you're arriving with this, Harvey. And those people who are opposing, those people who are opposing more flights.
No, nobody's saying that.
But that is the obvious result that you're coming away with, is that if you're going to reduce the amount of flights, and that we should keep it so that people can fly to China on business, but they can't go to Riga on holiday. That is not what the British public want. That is not what they're paying their taxes for. The government have put and increased the burden of air passenger duty on families, making those holidays more expensive. And look, people want to fly. That is what the demand projections show. Planes themselves are getting more efficient with fuel, quieter. Technology is being invested there. I think people who are arguing against flights, they are going to find themselves on the wrong side of the debate in the long run. And the question is how do we best deliver that increased capacity in this country? Personally, I would favour an expansion of Heathrow because it's the best deal for the taxpayer. Building an entirely new airport in the southeast requires a lot more investment from taxpayers, a lot more investment. Ultimately, it's probably best to let the market decide, but I think the market will go for Heathrow, especially when all the existing transport hubs, the transport connections, are suited to Heathrow. It's absolutely bonkers when Boris says that we should just turn the whole of Heathrow into a new London borough and axe it entirely. When the entire
New Garden City, I think.
The New Garden City. When the entire of
We're
southwest
all
London's
agreed on that. We're all agreed on the crazy idea of having an island in the middle of nowhere and turning London round. But the notion that you're pricing it off for ordinary families is just wrong. I mean, people can't afford lots of things. We can't all afford to live in mansions because there isn't enough land. We're actually using up a very precious resource, fuel, and we're creating a lot of damage through aviation, and that ought to be paid for. And that's what the taxes on aviation are, to some extent, a tax on the environmental damage they're causing.
If I might sort of widen the debate slightly, the government has last month announced £100 billion worth of new projects. Fiona, do you think there's enough emphasis on the environmental element to these projects? Does the government take the environment into account enough when it does these major projects?
Well, the government would argue that they do take the environment into account, but I don't think you can really say that the environment is sufficiently taken into account. Look, we've just had news today that the government is giving massive tax breaks to shale gas drilling. Now, some people would argue that shale gas drilling is very good for the UK and it's going to help provide a better energy infrastructure because we won't have to import so much gas. But people are very, very worried about the environmental consequences, and the consequences can be water pollution, air pollution, and also just the escape of methane, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas, and also the fact that burning gas produces carbon dioxide. So the environmental case against shale gas is also very strong, but the government is very keen to encourage it. On the other hand, look at some of the infrastructure plans around other aspects of energy. Renewable energy, we can see that as we build more renewable energy, the cost of that comes down, and that actually could be another source of indigenous energy for us. But in these infrastructure plans, that is given rather a back seat. Again, we've talked about transport, and transport infrastructure. It's absolutely vital that transport infrastructure is planned in a way that takes the carbon impact of that into account. And yet we don't really see joined up thinking on that either. So really, yes, infrastructure spending is extremely important. We really haven't spent enough on our infrastructure, on any kind of our infrastructure in the last few decades. But, we really need a much more robust system for looking at what the environmental impacts will be, especially the impact on carbon emissions and climate change.
You were talking about power generation. Isn't this one example where the government has failed to plan for infrastructure properly? We're now being threatened by the regulator with power cuts in the next few years if we don't do more, and renewables haven't quite managed to fill the gap.
It's absolutely astonishing that we are talking about power cuts, because this is a situation that anyone could have seen coming. And so the departing regulator of the energy network has warned of this, and really, I think the question must be, well, what were you doing for the last decade? Because we knew that lots of our old power stations would have to come out of service. Our nuclear power stations, many of them are now so old that they've already had their lives extended to the limit. They're going to have to come out of service. And yet we're not building new power generation capacity to replace this. And this is a situation that we should have seen coming, and successive governments have really failed. And I think part of the reason why they've failed is because there is just a fear of investment in infrastructure, because what happens when you try to invest in infrastructure in this country is, unfortunately, many people will just sort of leap upon you and say, oh, you can't do that, that's all wrong.
You can't do that here.
Yes, exactly. And that's a real problem.
Robert, is the power generation failures, is that illustrative of a lack of joined-up thinking from government?
Well, I certainly think there's been a failure to plan, and right to highlight that we haven't addressed that issue. The problem with the renewables investment that we have at the moment is that the government are having to subsidise it. And the way that the government are looking at this infrastructure investment is they're having to guarantee a price for, say, offshore wind, which is where they're going for a really big push. And they're guaranteeing a market value for the people who are producing offshore wind at 3 times the actual rate. They're going to miss their targets on bringing that rate down. We've seen that by 2020. Its own projections have basically showed that the energy bill has already failed. And the problem is what we've got a situation is where the government has failed to plan for this problem. So they're desperately running around trying to meet their own decarbonisation targets, targets which they've effectively gold-plated from 10 years ago and not really looked at the way the economy has changed. And it's meant that they've got this situation where they've got to guarantee investment in the electricity infrastructure, but they need to ensure that private firms do that. So they've got into this ridiculous situation where they are guaranteeing prices for energy firms, reducing the risk that they'll run so that they will hopefully invest in this decarbonisation project. But at the same time, because they're having to make these guarantees, it means that they're having to shift the burden onto bill payers. So those ordinary families are going to see their bills rise. But this ridiculous situation where we failed to plan, we are investing in a technology which isn't reliable, guaranteeing...
But it's not just renewables, is it? They've also got problems with nuclear.
Utterly.
EDF saying, right, well, we want price guarantees.
But the problem is their decision has been to go for renewables. This isn't just a criticism of renewables. This is a criticism of the way that they've decided to approach this whole issue.
But what would your solution be? Because the Taxpayers Alliance generally is against government spending. Yet it is perfectly sensible to subsidise renewables in their early stage, not for two reasons. One is because renewables are clearly better for the environment, but secondly also because it develops an industry and the prices might well catch up given the general overall rise in
but their
energy
prices aren't coming down. That's the problem. Is there's been this big argument that that this huge kind of economies of scale investment in offshore wind would bring down the price, but we've actually seen by the government producing its own strike price that it's not doing that. It's going to miss its own targets. So we have this situation where the bill payers are subsidising Emirati sheikhs who are investing in these big offshore wind farms. So the people making the investment, as I said, it was the recent creation of the London Array, which is the biggest wind farm in London, in the UK. They're guaranteed a profit out of that at the expense of bill payers. And so, I agree that, decarbonisation, there is that benefit. But the problem is that the government have shifted onto this thing, gold-plated it, made it rapid. And look at what's happening in the United States. They have made a conscious decision to invest in shale gas. And the United States is enjoying lower energy bills, economic growth off the back of that, and industry returning to the United States because energy is cheaper there. So that would be my example, is that stop gold plating and investing so heavily in renewables and actually look at more affordable forms of energy and look at the technology which is actually going to make this better.
In fact, shale gas actually it can emit more than burning coal in some circumstances if the wells that you drill are allowed to leak some of the methane into the atmosphere. And you can see that has happened in the US. But look, the UK is not the US and Sussex is not Wyoming. And we live in a very densely populated island and there isn't a lot of space. And this is the reason why infrastructure projects in the UK are so difficult, is because we have lots and lots of people. They're concentrated, especially in the southeast. You don't really see objections to wind farms in Scotland to anything like the extent. And we need to negotiate that space. So negotiating in favour of shale gas will upset quite a lot of people. Negotiating in favour of wind farms upsets other people. We're always going to be upsetting someone. So what you've got to look at is what is most scientifically rational, what is better for us in the long term. And it seems clear, given the issue of climate change, that we really need to prioritise that and prioritise cutting the carbon content of all the things that we do. And in terms of bill payers, energy bill payers having to pay for that, yes, they do pay for that, but energy bill payers will have to pay in any case. We've seen rising gas prices and energy bill payers have to pay for that. We've seen the fact that the national grid can no longer cope with the demands of balancing demand and supply, and so that's going to have to be upgraded, and we're all going to have to pay for that. That there isn't really a choice here in which we get off without paying anything. I'm afraid there is no free lunch.
Well, on that slightly depressing note, I'm afraid we have to finish. We've run out of time. Thank you very much to our guests, Christopher Wolmar, a transport specialist and author, Fiona Harvey, environment correspondent for The Guardian, and Robert Oxley, campaign director at the Taxpayers Alliance. Thank you all.